So I've been farming, my first full season was in 2011, and you can see my first season, that was all the onions I grew, and I was so proud of them. And then last year, the only reason I have a weird, like, professionally taken photograph is because USDA was looking for women farmers for their site, and so they came out. But so that was a portion of my crop. So I started out by growing onions that were just at the local hardware store. I didn't know what I was doing. And then now I grow about 40,000 onions. And so I have developed a number of different systems over the years that didn't work. And then I'm going to talk about what I do now that does work. Basically, the kind of the summary of what I do that works is that I try to mimic row crop production as much as possible. So I plant all of my onions on 36-inch row spacing, and am very consistent about my weed management with that, as well as making sure that I have a system in place for dealing with those onions. So this is just a little bit of stats about what has changed over the years for me. In 2012, 11, like I said, I went to the local hardware store and I bought a couple onion bulbs and I put them in the ground. And I don't even think I put them in straight rows. I was just so excited to get something in the ground. And I've had a big learning curve as a farmer, as a generation removed from farming. There's a lot of things that you don't think about. And so that first year, like I said, I didn't even have them in straight rows, which is really hard for weed management because you don't have a place to put your hoe. So when I'm talking to people who are just starting out, I tell them that the number one important thing is making sure that your row space is consistent, and that you have a plan for managing those weeds. Because the one thing that, even though we're talking about storage onions, it starts in the field. It starts about what's happening in that field and making sure that they're getting enough nutrients, that they're not being outcompeted by weeds, and that you're not bringing extra disease pressure in because of the weed hosts that can host things. My row spacing has changed over the years. I've tried 12 inches, I've tried 24 inches, and then last year I settled on 36 inches, which is what Susan Utes has been doing for a long time. And Laura, are you on that? You're on 40s, okay. So every farm has a different system that works for them, but all of my crops, whether it's radishes or onions or carrots, is all on the 36-inch row spacing at my farm. And that way that my one cultivator is always set up to take care of that. One of the things that I've noticed about onion production is that the minute you put them in the ground, you need to start thinking about weeds. And so what I do is, depends on the year, but I try to get in with I have a tool called a basket weeder, and I get in with that basically as soon as the onions have rooted. But when onions have rooted, you can start thinking about the weed management of that crop. Once they, at first, the problem with what I've found with onions is that you can't really go through with a cultivator right away because you might cover up the onions. Or if you do, which I've done it because I didn't want to take the time to change from my basket weeder to my cultivator on my piece of equipment, you're going so incredibly slow that it takes like 3 hours to cultivate 1 acre. So one of the things that I have found is that taking the time to think about multiple different passes with weed management. So the first thing we do is we plant them in April as soon as we can get in the ground. I use starts. I buy my starts from Dixondale Onions in Texas, and I buy them by the case. I buy about 20 cases a year, and each case has 30 bunches in it, and each bunch is between 60 and 100 onions. So I have around 40,000 onions, and we plant that way because I have limited greenhouse space. I don't have the greenhouse space on my current farm to be able to basically able to start the plants myself. I've also found that it's really tricky figuring out how to get your starts so that they're thick enough so that they are easy to plant. So we have a system of planting with the Dixondale starts, and I found that it's incredibly helpful for the way that I grow things is to get them from that company. Yeah.
Are those bare root?
Yes. So that's the question was why they bear roots. They basically come, they're grown in Texas in the field. They pull them out of the ground, they bunch them, and then they send them in the mail. And what I do is when we get them in the mail, we try to get them in the ground as soon as possible because basically that process of going dormant has already started when they've taken them out of the soil. So the first thing that we do is we go through the basket weeder a couple times. As soon as the onions are tall enough to be cultivated, we're going through that crop, especially in the months of May. We're trying to get there. I would like to get in every 5 days. It's more like every 7 days. And then by the time July comes around, I'm trying to get in the field at least every 10 days because I want to make sure that I'm maintaining that weed management. So I grow over 30 different types of vegetables. I am a CSA farm, so I'm not growing these for wholesale. I personally have found that there's not a lot of money in onions for wholesale. You can buy them very cheaply. I was at the grocery store the other day and was sort of appalled at how cheap you can buy onions. For me, it's part of a value-added system within my CSA box. People I have found in the CSA model want crops that are familiar to them, and everybody knows what to do with an onion, unless you're allergic, and I have a few customers that are allergic. But generally speaking, an onion is a way for me to maintain a consistency. So every single week of the summer, there are onions in the box. It starts in June, and I have a green onion in the box for about 4 to 6 weeks. We have green onion bunches, which is the same variety that I use for my summer onions. I just plant them closer together. So I plant those onions instead of planting my onions in the field for the storage onions and the summer onions are 4 inches apart. And for green onions, they're about 1 inch or 2 apart. So we begin by pulling those right away the first week of June, and then we transition to that summer onions. And I use Superstar, the variety for both the spring onions and the summer onions. And I probably do about 3 cases for green onions of 3 cases of plants, and then probably 1 or 2 cases for those summer onions. I've found, I've played with a number of different varieties over the years, and I have some that are really good that I love, like Elsa Craig is an amazing flavor, but they don't store worth a darn, even though they are a summer onion. So I'll plant a few of those and make sure that they go out immediately upon when they're ready. Once we transition from those green onions, we transition to like a summer onion, and we'll wash those and peel back the first layer and put them in a bunch. They're more like a fresh onion. And then as soon as we can start giving people dried onions, those are a heck of a lot less work. We spend a lot of time cleaning onions in the spring. And so once we transition to that fall onion, that storage onion, that's when we're thinking about how are we curing this. So we do cure some of our summer onions, but the majority of the onions that we cure are our fall onions, and I'll talk to you about the curing process in a second. So this is a picture on the right over here of one bunch of onions. One of the things that we do for speed is that we kind of have basically a couple of things. One, I learned from Laura Krause, you never let anybody sit in your field. And this is particularly true around onions. I use onions as a way of interviewing my potential workers for the year. And it's a brutal, and they work 10-hour days. The rest of the summer, we don't work that long, but if they can make it through a 10-hour onion planting and still be smiling, like these 3 were that year, they were hired for the year. And so I use that as an opportunity. It's really hard sometimes to do working interviews with people it's really important to me, so I use onions as a way of doing that. I also find that the timing of onion production, it's one of those things that once the window of opportunity finally opens up, we have to get them in the ground really quickly. So it usually takes us about 2 days and we get them all in. But we do hand plant, so we're hand planting 40,000 onions. We're taking boxes out to the field. The boxes are opened up. You take a bunch. You have it in one hand. You don't put the rubber band somewhere else. You put it around your wrist, and then it's a badge of honor at the end of the day. How many onions did you plant? And I actually, my employees don't know this, but I look at their wrists throughout the day, and I see especially if I'm using it as an interviewing tool, who's going through those bunches fastest. So this is an example of onion planting. This was from this last year. This is one of my 2 fields of onions from this last year, and everything from the mulch on the left-hand side to the green grass on the right-hand side was onions. And then there was another field as well. But we're also kind of working together. I've done different things where people use different rows or where we kind of leapfrog each other, and I find that people move fastest when they're leapfrogging each other, and that anytime you walk down the road to get more onions, you get a couple extra bunches to hand to the next person to make sure that you're keeping that process going. So like I said, for weed control, I basket weed in May, and we hoe if necessary. This last year, we had the April blizzards basically, and normally I plant onions like around April 4th is when I like to get my onions in the ground, that first week of April. We weren't able to get our onions in the ground to the last week of April, but because we mail order these onions, we had to figure out what to do with them when they came in the mail on the first Wednesday of April, and didn't know when we were going to get in the ground. There was still a couple inches of snow on the ground. So what we did was we took them out of the cases, or opened up the cases, took them out of each of the rubber bands, and we let them kind of, basically they needed room to air out because otherwise they would rot. And then I turned my walk-in cooler up. It normally is around 38 degrees, and we turned it up to 60 degrees. So it would basically just be like an air-conditioned room for the onions. And we put them into dormancy. Basically, we were trying to force them to go dormant so that they wouldn't rot. Once we got them to go dormant, we had to wake them back up. So we had to irrigate our onions right away. So in a little bit, when Dan's talking, you'll see that he's going to talk about a system that was fully on plastic. But because we're not on plastic, we don't normally irrigate onions. We get them in April, they get watered in with rain, and then we don't worry about it. So this last year, because they had gone dormant, plus it was super dry once we did plant, we had to irrigate them. But because we irrigated them, the weeds started coming on. And I was out there multiple days in a row. I think for 3 days in a row, I made sure, and I had to go pretty slow, so I was cultivating that field, and we still couldn't get ahead of the button weed that were coming in. So we ended up hand hoeing, and it was the best decision I made all summer. And it took, it took a number of hours of labor to do that, but it really cut down on the weed pressure for the summer. And then by the time the onions were big enough for me to get in and cultivate, I was able to have it under control. So it was an extra step that I don't normally do, but I was really glad I did. We also do a couple hand weedings every summer. We try to get at least one hand weeding in, if not a second. And I find that I've had years where I've really lost control of my onions, so I get pretty anal about trying not to lose control of them because I would rather sacrifice another crop than onions at the point when onions need to be taken care of because it really does affect their size. It affects my whole year. So this was my second field of onions last year. That first field was the one that was being planted. This is the second field. And this was a mid-season. Those have been, probably cultivated 10 times or something. I just kept on it every few days. The other thing I'll say is that on my farm, I don't have a lot of people that do the cultivation. It's me. I recently got married, and I'm trying to train my husband to cultivate, so I'm hoping that works for me next year. But I find that having that time to cultivate, I've had different people say different things. I've had mentors that have told me, you need to do your cultivating when the crew's not there so that you can really work with them while they're there. And I've decided that I would love for that to work, but by the time the crew is gone and other things are happening, I'm having a really hard time getting through the rest of the things that need to happen that day. So I decided for me on my farm at this point in this juncture, I'm going to get my crew started on something and I'm going to go get cultivating done. But you have to realize that when the crew is doing some really hard task and you're sitting on a tractor, they think it's pretty easy. And so I talk a lot about what it takes to cultivate and why it's hard and what could happen if I did it wrong. And I kind of help them understand why this task is so important. So therefore, they're not mad at me when I'm sitting on the tractor and they're hand weeding something. So this is a picture of curing. I have done a couple different things for curing. I've had different storage. As a beginning farmer who rents land, I've had different storage options at different farms I've been at. One time we took a wagon and we made a triple tier structure out of the wagon and cured them in a barn and then left them on those wagons. And what we found is there wasn't a lot of airflow. They start rotting. So really what I've learned is airflow is incredibly important, as well as not leaving them in too hot of an area for too long. Different farms work differently. I think it's really important to say that because I have a friend who has a beautiful old barn that has lots of airflow in it, and I think it's hard sometimes when you read, a wholesale book that tells you onions need to be stored at this temperature with this humidity, and it's really hard to repeat that on your own farm. And so thinking through what works for you and what works in the books is not always the same. So some of the things, like I said, that haven't worked is I've tried the wagons. One of the reasons it didn't work was because the barn was too hot. It was a metal building. And the second reason it didn't work was because there wasn't enough airflow underneath. Another thing I've tried is leaving them in the greenhouse longer as they're curing, using that as a storage method. Again, they started rotting in the greenhouse. So last year, 2 years ago, I kept them in crates in the barn, and my barn is a metal building. It gets super hot. And I thought, well, other people leave them in their barns. Why can't I? Well, their barns are old wooden barns that have airflow through them. So another thing to think about, that different farms are different. Last year, so I have an apartment in the back of my barn, and this will not be happening this year. Like I said, I got married. But last year what I did is I took brown paper sacks and put the cured onions in them and tried to store them that way, because at least I could get them in the house, and it was less degrees, but I still am having about 50% loss. And that's not loss, like all of those onions. First of all, two things. One, I have a really high standard when it goes in the CSA share. So I'm talking about like highest quality versus like I would feel bad if a CSA member got this. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is we donate all of that to the food pantry. So they're very grateful for those seconds, because they're still edible seconds, but they're seeing some soft necks and other things like that. One of the things that I've learned is for onions, there's three really things that are important. One is watering, consistent watering. And in the age of climate change, that's really difficult, because we have these huge 5-inch rain events and things like that. And so if the watering, you can do everything, even if you choose to irrigate. I have chosen to not irrigate my onions unless absolutely necessary. I did in 2012 when we were in a drought. But mostly I've chosen not necessarily to irrigate onions. And one of the things that I found is that actually can impact storage. But there's a couple other things that can also impact it. One is thrips, and I am learning more about thrips. I've had thrips in the past and controlled for them, but didn't really know how to identify them. And last summer, my onions were looking funny, and I was like, I think I've got something, but I don't know what it is. And have since identified that I had thrips and didn't realize it. So that can also impact your storage. And then the third thing is actually how you store them. So this next year, what I've done is I've purchased a used walk-in cooler, and I'm going to put onions on bread trays so they have better airflow in a walk-in cooler that's going to be at 55 degrees. And I'm also going to put my squash and my sweet potatoes in that same walk-in cooler. I will not be putting my regular potatoes in there, because regular potatoes and onions do not store well together, but I'll be putting my squash, my sweet potatoes, and my onions in that. And so one of the things that we're working on is I found the cooler, we have it purchased now, and but also trying to figure out the mechanisms for airflow and things like that. I'll probably use a CoolBot to get it down to the right temperature, but the next thing that I'm thinking about is ventilation, because you really don't want to have a lack of ventilation, because that's a really important thing. So that's still a work in progress for me, is finding the ideal storage on my farm. But I found that sometimes you have to do things that are not ideal. And so for me, one of the not ideal solutions was planting maybe more onions than I actually need. And as over time, as I get those other things worked out, I might be able to plant less onions. So this was last year or 2 years ago in bins in the barn. So variety selection, obviously, if you're going to have a storage onion, you need a storage onion variety. And there's summer onions, there's intermediate day and long day varieties and things like that. Really good yellow variety is Copra. Really good red variety is Red Zeppelin. There are lots of other ones, but those are two that I like. Thrips control, scout early and often, usually appears in July, and have a control plan if they arrive. And I spent about an hour on the phone the other day with Johnny Seed and developed a control plan for next summer for my farm, and I'll share that with you in a second. Oh, here we go, right now. You can surround as kale and clay. This is an organic approved thing you can do, and it's basically it's a white powder that's just literally clay. I think someone else can correct me if I'm saying this, but you can add, if you spray that on your onions, the thrips don't want to land on it. However, onions are really waxy, so one of the tips that I got from Johnny's was to add some soap to it. You have to make sure it's the right soap that you want to add if you're organic approved and things like that, but having some surfactant that you're adding to that to get the surround to stick to the onion plants can be really helpful. Then the second thing is if you found thrips, then you need to start spraying for them. And you want to spray. You don't with a spray. First of all, if you're organic, which I follow organic practices, you want to spray things that are organic approved. And then the second thing is that you don't want to spray the same thing, because you can develop a resistance. So what they suggested was spraying in trust 1 week, which is incredibly expensive. It's like $500 for like a little thing, for us, that's for a vegetable production that can be expensive. So I usually, when I buy in trust, I go in with a number of farms together. So if you're on the Iowa City area and want to buy in trust with me this year, let me know. And then the other thing is spraying Pyganic the opposite week. And I really think that control of thrips is one of the issues that I've had for storage. Based on some pictures that Dan's going to show of thrips, it looks exactly like something that happened to my crop last summer. And the weird thing was my crop looked fantastic. And then one day I went out there, actually Liz and I were doing a field walk on my farm, and it was right before my PFI field day of all things, because I was so proud of those onions. And then of course the day before the field day, that's when I noticed that something's wrong, and couldn't quite figure out what it was. But now looking back, I know that it was thrips. So I want to be kind of more on top of that. So that's all I got. Thanks, guys.
All right, I'm Dan Fillius. I currently, as Kate said, I currently work here at Iowa State in Extension, working on educating vegetable farmers about food safety, produce safety, and getting folks ready for FSMA. But before this, until September, I'd been a vegetable farmer for 11 years, and most recently I was at Featherstone Farm, which is in southeastern Minnesota, 140 acres of vegetables, and then another 100 acres or so of like fallow and transitioning. But it was a large farm and did a lot of stuff with tractors, and I'm going to present first about my experience growing onions there, and then follow that up with some slides from when I worked at the Michigan State Student Organic Farm when I managed that before I was at Featherstone Farm. So two different scales. I've got a lot of slides. I'll hope to breeze through some pictures quick here. But feel free, questions, clarifying comments throughout, please. All right. So first, propagation. We started all of our onions early, and we didn't warm up our greenhouse until we tried to push that as late as possible to fire that up. So we had our warehouse that was already had a heated pad, and so we would start our first plants in the warehouse on that heated floor, and to get another week or two before we had to fire up our greenhouse. So this is thawing out our Vermont compost slings and Cosmo slings in our greenhouse there. And we also sanitized all of our trays. We planted onions into 128s here, and so these are all drying in the greenhouse. This is what we'd fill and mix our soil in. Although in the case of onions, we transplanted, or we planted right into Fort Light from Vermont compost, so we didn't mix. But for other plants, we would mix like 50-50 Cosmo and Vermont compost, depending on what it was. And for some things, we felt like they didn't need as much nutrient. We like Cosmo, we like Vermont compost. In our experience, it just seemed like the plants could hold on a little bit longer in straight Vermont. And but for things that were in the greenhouse for a shorter period of time, we would mix half and half Vermont and Cosmo to save on costs there. So this is us filling. We did not have for being such a large farm, you might expect that we'd have an automated like filler for trays, but no, we did it all by hand. And this is us dibbling. You can see this is the dibble that would be left in the soil surface. And the way we did it was we had two 128s nested together, two like trashed ones, where like one was kind of ripped on one side and one was ripped on the other side. We'd nest them and then push down, and that would leave a little imprint for the seeds to go in. We like to vacuum seed our onions. This last year, the two varieties that we usually grow, which were Candy and Red Long of Tropea, were not available pelleted, so we had to hand seed them all. So we've looked for other varieties. We trialed a couple others. We liked what we saw with Ailsa Craig and Cabernet this year, so those are the varieties we're going with. You might say, Dan, Ailsa Craig's not a storage onion, and you'd be right. And neither is Candy, for that matter, or Red Long of Tropea. But we've sort of, even though this is, we grow a lot of onions, but it was over the years we found that we were just, due to thrips, due to high rain events, we just weren't getting the storage out of our storage onions that we were growing. We had better luck with fresh ones. So we just started to switch over more to fresh ones and to cure them as best we could to get some in our early winter shares. And then we would buy in organic onions from other large organic growers in the area to be our longer storing ones, because onions are not, like you said, you went to the store and you were shocked at how low the cost is. Like, we know that our CSA members wanted them in there, but but that was something that we were struggling with, and so. Yes, we go back and forth, I suppose. Like, do we grow really great storage onions, or do we buy them in? We're still vacillating. But at my time at the Student Organic Farm that I'll talk about later, I definitely have a lot more experience from there with good varieties. If you're looking for pro tips on that, but I'll talk about growing onions a lot here. So we dibbled. We would cover our trays with vermiculite and soil, a little bit of soil, a little bit of vermiculite on that. You can see here's a stack of 8 trays. This is how we'd seed them, we'd cover them, and then we'd stack them in stacks of 8 like this, slightly askew, and then this would sit on the heated slab, and this is how we would germinate them. And as soon as the radicals, we'd dig around, and as soon as the radicals had popped, then we'd know that they'd start to come out of above the soil surface, and we'd need to get them unstacked. So then we'd carry them out to the greenhouse at that point. But while they're germinating, that week or so or longer, they would sit stacked like this. So yeah, like I said, we'd carry them out. Here they are coming out to the greenhouse. This is Abby, who is now in my position at Featherstone Farm. So prepping beds, we in all of our fields, we had a really big issue with black rot, which if you were in the cauliflower session last, there was a lot of talk about how bad that is, and that's in a brassica issue, not an onion issue. But we decided that we would start to remineralize our soils at that point as a strategy to combat the black rot. But it's, I guess you could say, it's trickling. The benefits are trickling down to the other crops also. And so we just rent a spreader from Midwest BioAg, which was just up the street in Minnesota there, and we would, yeah, please.
Two things. One, you guys all have a handout. If you don't, we can get you one. But it has each of the varieties that we use and all of the methods we use. And I also just wanted to interject that I also do the same thing where I rent a spreader from Midwest BioAg and spread on the ground. Nice.
Yeah, for us, it ends up costing, I think, like $150 to do, I don't know, dozens of acres to do this. We buy the minerals separately. That is many more dollars than $150. But we have a friend of the farm who consults with us and tells us we get a soil test from each field, and then we make a custom blend. So anyway, that's the first step. We then use a big old tractor, this Ford 9700, to chisel our fields, and we like to leave our fields chiseled, if either in a cover crop over the winter, or if it's an early crop like onions, then we like to leave it chiseled, or with a winter killed cover crop from the winter. And we find that the soils dry out faster if it's just left chiseled after the winter, if that's the stage that you're entering the year with, and we leave it in that state for as long as possible. Like, say we don't chisel it until the spring, but we can't get out there to make the beds. We like to chisel it and leave it that way until like the day before or the day of bed making, because it just dries out with these big rains that we're having. It'll dry out faster. So we'll finish disc it after it's chiseled, or if it's got a lot of debris in it, we'll use this offset disc. But otherwise, we'll use this finished disc with the wings down, and that's just a light. It does a light pass, and it's really nice and fluffy for our bed shaper, which I'll show you in a sec. But even the bigger you are, the harder you fall. This is things happen. So this is the bed shaper. We do use plastic mulch in our onions, and we had issues getting our coverage of these discs that are. Which one's here it is? These discs right here that cover the edges of the plastic. We had issues for years, like how do we get these to cover the plastic well? And we'd move them in, move them down, and have somebody sit on the arm, and none of those really reliably worked. And ultimately, if you're having that issue with your with your plastic mulch layer, our solution was lengthening the top length that's up here, just making it a little bit longer, and that solved the problem because it made the back end drop a little bit lower, which got the discs in there a little bit better. We use 4-foot black plastic mulch. And so this is an old system. I have these two here. You can see the soil is pretty chunky here, and this is back when we were not before we really got that chisel and leave it chiseled system, before we'd chisel in like disc and leave it sort of disc, then it would rain on it, and then it wouldn't dry out well, and so we'd then run over it again right before we'd make the beds, and so it ended up being wetter when we'd work it, and it ended up being really chunky, and that's another thing that was causing not good coverage here. You can see like a bulge right here and a little pucker in right there, like that's chunks underneath that, and that's not comfortable to plant into if you've ever been planting in something like that. So the new system here, you can see this soil right here is a lot fluffier where we left it chiseled and then finish disked it. So anyway, that's the new system, much more packed in there underneath the plastic. Regarding plastic, I'm just going to cut to like later in the season now, like what do we do with this plastic? How do we get it out of the field? Because plastic is like such a headache, right? Well, we have a Rainflow plastic mulch lifter, which actually does pretty well with, this is parked on the field edge, this is not a field, but some of our fields look that weedy. I'll show you a picture later. But these discs right here do a really good job of cutting away trash to allow these shanks to go through there. And here's a video of it ripping through there, and it does pretty well in heavy soils, does pretty well in trash, and this is a parsley bed that's being lifted, but the next step is we have crews walk through and remove the plastic by hand. There are lifters that wrap the plastic, but we don't. You might think that we're big enough that we should have one of those, and I think that too, but we couldn't. We still have money issues too. We couldn't afford everything we wanted. So anyway. Here's a crew going through and picking that up. And then here's another video of a guy. This basically just goes about this pace. This is one of our fastest workers, Juan Luis. If the audio is playing, you'd be able to hear the music coming out of that little speaker on his hip belt there. He's got his iPod plugged into that, playing some nice, what you might think is mariachi music. We used a lot of H2A labor at Featherstone Farm. All right, so then after that, they'd throw piles of plastic, and then we'd send a tractor with a trailer to go through and collect that plastic. Then the drip tape would be wound on a wire winder that we got for $1,000 at the local tractor dealer, and that did a really good job at winding tight balls of drip tape, which cut down on the space that it would take to dispose of that. And then around that time, we also took advantage of this recycling opportunity. A lot of farms, a lot of dairies in the area had a lot of silage tarps and there was this network of trucks that would go around and empty and recycle that. They also take drip tape. They do not take plastic mulch. That had to go in the landfill. But the drip tape they would take, and tight wraps of it would meet their requirements for a weight. It was only worth their while if it was a certain weight of plastic in those dumpsters. So it would fill up every like 8 weeks or something. And then after that, after we get the plastic out, we'd run through with a grain drill and seed a cover crop. So transplanting.
And is that winter rye, or what are you planting at that point?
I wish we had a really solid rotation at Featherstone Farm, and we don't. So it really depends on what is going to be next, and it's not always the same thing. Typically we would do rye vetch around that time. We also might, since those come out in like August.
Yeah, because you never let an August sun hit your onions, says my grandmother.
The words to live by, right there. Yeah, that's we sometimes would put in oats and peas in that, depending on what was going to be, what we thought would be following it the following year. But we don't. We rent all of our land at Featherstone Farm, and so some years we wouldn't have we would be losing a field, and some things would be transitioning. It was although we were certified organic, so transitioning, it wouldn't have been that situation, but. Does that answer your question? Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so transplanting, we would move them out of the greenhouse onto these converted hay racks here with wood decks. Each one holds about 80 to 90 plants. We have about 16 of those trailers that are just always full through the season with plants, and we just hook up to those after they're moved out of there. A week later, we'll take them right out to the field with the transplant crew and transplant them. And this is Ophelia, and she figured out a way to transport a third tray with her, even though she's only got two hands, and we applauded her for that. Here's the train of vehicles. We've got the tractor with the transplanter on the back there. We've got a tractor hiding right here, pulling 2 trailers hitched together full of plants, and then the truck, the flatbed truck, pulling this what we call the hot dog tank, which is a long cylinder. There's another one that's like that we call the hamburger tank also. But the hot dog tank is always full of fish mixed with water, and the hamburger tank was always straight water. And so this was what we refilled the transplanter with, which. When you're filling it up with fish, just be careful that you don't spill the bucket of fish on yourself, right? Here we are filling the tank, pumping it off out of the hot dog tank into the transplanter, and then going away and transplanting right there. So we plant each plug in the 128s, that's 2 seeds, 2, maybe 3, but just striving for 2 seeds per cell, planted every 6 inches, 2 rows per bed in the plastic here. And we did about a quarter acre of onions, I think is what we grew. So not really that much out of our 140 acres. It was just a CSA crop. We did not wholesale onions at all. Here's we had a hydrostatic. This is an International 70 hydrostatic that could creep along the field for that 6-inch spacing. It made it a lot easier. We also had another transplant tractor, which was an International 656, which is same tractor basically, but gasoline rather than diesel. But they both hydrostatic. And here is a picture of our lovely farm. And we were in the driftless region up there in Minnesota, but these beds right here, there are 4.5 beds of onions. These are 400 feet long beds right here next to our greenhouses that year. All right, here's those same beds, 1, 2, 3, 4.5, and then parsley was right next to it. And you can see we irrigate with blue lay flat here. This is a 2-inch lay flat with T-tape underneath the beds here, 2 rows of drip tape underneath each bed. I wish we could get by with, I wish black plastic mulch meant you didn't have to weed the bed, but every single plant hole, in our fields at least, which are not weed free, every single hole needs to be hand weeded. Some years it's horrible. Like this year was awful. It was so bad. People on their hands and knees doing exactly what you wouldn't hire them for, Kate. But it was so slow going. It was so sad. There was like 50 maybe weeds per hole. It was gross. This is where we pump from, the Root River. Right next to there, we suck the water out with this big old pump, this Godwin pump. It's got I hear it's got the same engine as our John Deere 4020. For cultivation purposes, this is one of our cultivators, a Kubota 265? So yeah. Anyway, this is the first setup, which is a shovel on each side, a sweep on each side that would just mound and bury any little weeds on the edges of the plastic. After that only works a couple, 2 or 3 times max, because at some point there's no more soil to throw back up, and you've missed some weeds along the top edge. The soil goes up, but it flows back down, and there's some weeds that from the first time that are bigger now along the top edge. So, and this is a situation where it sort of can get away, where it looks like it's getting away from you. This is peppers, not onions, but it's the best picture I had of like the situation where we might then bring in the next step, which is using a side knife or a banana knife, I've heard them called. And it's this, like, imagine this edge right here is like where the plastic is, and there's another mirror image on the other side. And this slices, it's traveling this way, and it slices away the soil from the edge of the plastic, and then this disc right here is piling it back up. So it's cutting away all those big weeds and uprooting them, and then sort of flipping it and reburying the plastic with that other disc.
Is this a belly mounted implement?
This is a belly mounted implement. Yeah, it's like this. There's like, you want roughly 1 inch between the plastic and this knife, and yes, it will tear the plastic 2 to 3 times per bed. That's just, but at that point, it's a month and a half or so after, or 2 months after planting, and things are settled. That you've had some rains to settle down the edges. You will tear it, but it won't make your whole bed fly away at that point. So this is a picture of weedy onions, and also I included this picture because this is definitely a planting that has thrips, and so the onions are, you can see there's just a general like sort of brown and gray cast to these onions, and that's what when I look out on the field and I see that, it's because the thrips, and they nibble down in the tissue, this like the outer tissue of the leaves, and they leave little like channels that are sort of whitish, and that just makes them overall less. The plants are less green. They are more grayish cast, and that's how I can describe it, I suppose. Here's a closer up picture of it. It's just. Anyway, the issue with thrips, and we spray and trust on ours, and it only happens like once every 3 years that we feel like we need to. This was one of those years. Is that the thrips, they hide right where those leaves like join. They get down in that space, and so spraying is like you got to scout and identify them real early. Otherwise, the population is just down in that crotch there, and where the spray just can't get to. And so it's really difficult to one of those situations where scouting is super, super important.
Can you talk about how you scout and what you're looking for when you scout?
Yeah. So when I'm looking for, I will look down in that crotch area, and I'll look for they're almost microscopic. So I'm going to look there, and I'm going to see if I see a tiny thing moving. It's difficult, but basically what I've found is that when you start to see the little channels or the little like damage on the leaves, it's almost too late at that point. So going and like dissecting like an onion and
so would you start looking like the third week of June every day?
Yeah,
kind of go destroy one onion and see what you find.
Yeah, late June is probably when I'd start looking. Yeah. Here's some hail damage.
At that point, I mean, if you think about it, we only have like 4 weeks left in the field.
Yes.
So if you're looking every day, and if you see anything, that's when you start spraying once a week.
Yeah,
right? Okay.
Probably. Yeah, exactly. Hail onions, even though they're small, they're not immune from hail. So here's some hail damage that happened on our onions this last year. You can maybe see just a little bit of like. It's different than thrips, but it's another issue, but they grew out of it. And then the one nice thing about onions is that it gave us some time afterwards. These are the same beds. It allowed us time to plant a fall crop, to double crop these beds. So they come out early. We planted spinach and put a tunnel over that. So that's
and
nice.
I usually plant, I often will plant carrots or something after mine too. So a lot of those fall crops that still have time to grow.
Nice. Okay, for harvesting, in situations where it did get really weedy, like I said, it's a 1/4 acre of onions on our farm, and that's like a tiny little bit of our 140. So they would sometimes be like, they would be ignored because we have like 10 acres of broccoli that we need to be looking at, and that's much more of a moneymaker. So they would get weedy, like, look how many weeds are in this pathway. That is just disgusting. And but it happens, and and so these have all fallen down, and so we just mowed the whole thing so we could see the onions, and then we went in and pulled them out like that. And that's the same field, but some beautiful onions now just left out there for a couple days to dry down a little bit in the field before we could go collect them. And then we'd go back into the field with pallet bins, these guys, and fill them up by hand. And this is not the way to cure onions, but it is the way that Featherstone did it before I was there. And we lost probably 50% of these onions. It was. I mean, imagine how hot it is in there. And you've got, they're basically, when they tell you to compost something, right? They're like, build it of a certain size, right? It's basically a backyard composting size. It's just composting in the middle there. It's awful. So ultimately this year we came back to the very labor intensive but very successful way, which is to layer them in the greenhouse on a bench. The greenhouses are pretty much empty at that time, put them out on the wire benches with, the greens from one overlapping the other one, sort of like shingles on a roof, and I've got a picture of that later, but from a student organic farm. But this was not successful here. Neither is dumping this bin onto one of our like hay rack wagons and leaving them in a pile in that greenhouse. That is also not successful.
Also, along with that, the idea that onions are very fragile, and
Yes.
so one of the things that we do on our farm is we treat them like, I tell everybody an onion's like an egg. And so you really, any bruise that you get in the field, that's going to allow for bacteria and things to get in to rot it faster. So we're incredibly careful with them. And then can I interject one thing,
Please.
Dan? Sorry. One of the things that we do when we get them in the greenhouse is when we do trim the tops, we cut them after the bend in the onion. So the onion, first of all, you're harvesting them after they've fallen down in the field. That's how you know they're ready. But then secondly, when you get them after they've been cured, and that's when the greens dry, they're completely dry when they're cured, you want to pretty immediately after that get the tops cut off, but you want to make sure you're cutting them after the natural bend.
Like above the natural bend?
And that's because you want to, basically it's already sealed itself off. So if you're careless and just cut anywhere you want to cut, you're creating a new wound to get bacteria into that onion. So you want to cut above the bend. And then we also just very carefully take the outer layer of the onion and kind of let it slough off, but we don't like aggressively try to do that. And then we like that, I can't stress enough that like an onion's like an egg. You got to be really careful with it. So anytime you're dumping it into something, it can really bruise it.
Yeah. We did grow Red Wing at Featherstone, and that was a really successful, like decent store for us. It also, we typically go in like late June and we start harvesting for like fresh onions for our CSA, and we do that every couple weeks, until it's harvest time, like late July, and then we harvest the rest of them for storage and cure them. So this is a picture of some fresh ones that we harvested, and this would be like how much we would harvest for our CSA. We have like 700-ish members in our CSA, and this is our storage. Like this is a picture of our warehouse packed to the gills for winter storage. This is not onions. This is how we store carrots, five high, and then this would be probably cabbage right here, or no, that wouldn't be cabbage. That would be like roots or beets or something like that, because we don't wrap the cabbage in plastic. But like this, they would be stacked like this in our cooler. Our onions would be, but we'd only have nowadays we have, I think, probably 10 to 15 bins of onions.
And that's after they've been cured that you put them in the cooler.
Yes, post curing.
What is your rate of loss in that method?
In the curing?
No, after you get them in the walk-in cooler and you're getting them out to put them in a winter delivery or something.
Probably 10 to 20%. Yeah, it's like, and we don't sort through them really until we're on the CSA line, and then we're like, if that one's bad, we just like pitch it, and it's 10. 10's high, yeah. That is, let me refer back to my handout 1 second. 34 to 40 degrees in a walk-in cooler. Thank you very much. Yep. Yes. Yeah, we don't have it's like we set our coolers for other crops, and then we find the place where onions make the most sense, and we put it in there, and it works okay. So never mind. This is our warehouse where we store our boxes and do a little bit of work. We have a loading dock. The picture was taken from the loading dock. This room over here with the windows is in here, so this is on the other side of that wall. This is where we pack CSA. Here's yellow onions and red onions getting ready for CSA packing here. Some people packing greens into a bag. Here's CSA all set up with the roller conveyor down the middle, and here's a video of us packing CSA. Oh no. Here's a video of us packing CSA. 6 or 7 more. So all the boxes on the back there on cardboard on their sides, they're not touching the floor. Good job, Featherstone. In that way. I can't say we're the great example in all the other ways. And then this is like a typical CSA share. You can see how many onions we like to put in our shares in the winter. This is a winter CSA share. All right, so that's that. I'm going to try to breeze through student organic farm stuff because I'm at 25 minutes. Sorry, Kate. Sorry, folks, for questions. Please jump in if you have questions. Yes? Okay, thank you very much, Liz. So yeah, again, these are from the Michigan State University Student Organic Farm, where I was the field production manager there for 5 years, and much smaller scale and more intensive. So we started them at the Student Organic Farm in open flats and with a lot of soil. Like this is really soil intensive, but we would also start them in like the middle of January and plant them same date as we planted them in Featherstone. Featherstone, we'd start them beginning of March, and they'd be planted in the middle of April. Here we'd plant them in the middle or somewhere in the second half of January and plant them in the field in the middle of April. And you can see they're just starting to emerge here. We grew a lot of different varieties, a lot more storage varieties there. Here they are coming up. And there we would do, we made our own soil mix there, and it had a lot, and we made the compost for it. Then we mixed in peat moss and perlite, and then that would, because we made our own compost, it had a lot more weeds. So we would always be grazing and like picking through and getting those weeds out of there. And then we would give these plants, because they were in there for a lot longer, we'd give them haircuts, and that would happen 2 or 3 times before we planted them. And so here they are, floppy, just pre-haircut. This is them. You can see how stocky these are, not floppy at all. This is what they'd look like after several haircuts and in the field, getting ready to plant. So here's our field. This is 180 feet long, 4 beds, all hand planted, not with a water wheel, 4 rows. This is before we have our irrigation set up. So on a hot day, so we have a hose stretched out the length and just watering them all down each line with a hose. And this is them a little bit later. These I'll show you that all by hand. It's all by stirrup hose. So this is a comparison. We like to grow things side by side. This is one of these this is Calibra, and this one's Copra. 2 small, really hard onions, and they were both very good. I don't know. You said Copra is still available from the folks in Texas. That's good news. I thought Copra was not available anymore, at least from seed. I hadn't seen it in a long time, I think. So this is like pre-weeding, and then here's Greg Jones with his stirrup hoe, and then this is us hoeing, and this is what it looked like afterwards. Yay! And then I wish the sound would play on this, but oh yeah, there you go. It's got a fun noise in which from where these onions are popping out. Okay, we'll try. Where's the speaker? We grew mostly on the dirt at Michigan State, but then we had a leftover black plastic beds like from our tomatoes, I think, the year before in that field, and we were like, well, why don't we try growing it on the same plastic bed and just put more holes in it and plant those right in there. First of all, that was very difficult because the soil was just so hard after the winter to get those in, so we were in there with trowels like planting these onions, but they grew gorgeous. You saw how big those onions were. That was really nice. And but anyway, it works and it doesn't work. This is that style that I was talking about. We have just bulb crates, old bulb crates in one of our empty high tunnels at Student Organic Farm here instead of in the greenhouse. But these were covered up by the leaves of each other. And this was pretty much our entire onion crop, but it was a much smaller CSA, and this was our whole winter's worth of onions. This is Sierra Blanca. It's a variety I really, really like for white storage onions. There it is. And Cortland is a yellow that I really, really like for a good store. And then this is at another farm that I worked at before Student Organic Farm. This is in a biodynamic farm in Wisconsin. And this is when I had like very little experience. And I had read somewhere in a book that if your onions haven't fallen over by a certain date, just knock the tops over with a rake. And I was like, oh yeah, that's what a good farmer does. And one could, but one does not need to, in my opinion now. And these are beautiful onions that I think we could have left in the field for a few more weeks, and they would have done this naturally. But they stored well for us, and except that we then, another rookie mistake, on the soil inside of a nice old wooden barn, it was nice and cool and well ventilated in there, but we put the greens underneath, and they all just turned into this nasty, gushy like mat. And so don't do that. Maybe airflow. Yeah, exactly. I think I saw yours. You had them on a mesh table with the greens underneath, and that works. Is that what it's? Yeah. Mostly you have to have that underneath airflow. Exactly. Yeah, we were there a week and a half later, just flipping them over and having the greens on top. So it was like, wasted work. But anyway, that's what I've got to show about onions. What questions do you all have? Yeah. Go ahead, Steve. Yeah. Sorry? The cure. Oh, the question is, how long is the curing process? And for us, it's because onions were sort of this like neglected crop. It would ideally be 1 week, maybe a week and a half, 2 weeks. But for us, it extended up to a month in some situations, and there was definitely more loss to the onions because of that. Kate?
Yeah, I would say the same, about 10 days. But you want to make sure that they're completely dried down before you take them out of the curing process. But you kind of want to get them the day they're completely dried down.
Yes.
Because what you're doing is otherwise you're leaving them in an environment that's too hot for them and they're going to start rotting.
Yeah, and it's different for each variety too. Like because different varieties that will be more fleshy in their leaves but I usually like to harvest all of my onions at the same time because I've got a crew there. So I don't know. So not all of them will necessarily be ready on the same day, but I do keep an eye because I agree 100% with what Kate just said.
Okay, so there's just an old saying in the farming communities, never let an August sun hit your onions, and it basically means get them out of the field. And the reason, but before August 1st, another one is never let an August moon hit your onions. So there's a 12-hour difference there, a fight among the farming community. But the reason for that is because you don't want to leave them in the field after they're ready because it's also hot outside and they're going to start rotting. Yeah. So you have to think about like when you're planning for your onion production. Some years I have gotten my crop out of the field even, weather is changing. Sometimes it's the, 20th of July and sometimes it's the 1st of August. So there's like a 10 to 15 day window that they could be getting ready, but you kind of want to just generally think that I need to have the crew ready at the end of July, early August to make sure this gets done. Otherwise, if you don't have your labor planned for that, that's kind of why I think of that in my own head.
One more thing I'd say about that is that these increasing prevalence of big like torrential rains that we're having it seems that has caused more of a problem with bacterial soft rot in our onions. Like as they start to dry down or whatever, the leaves get like less vigorous and they let more water in between the leaves. And I see this when I'm buying onions at the store. I buy a bag of yellow onions and like 3 of them have like, I cut them in half and it's all like rotten in the core, like that's that. And so it's other people have this issue too. So anyway, if I see a big rain coming, I would pull the trigger on the harvest earlier than and obviously
you can always dry them down more in the greenhouse.
Yeah.
Like you want to wait till they've fallen over, but if you're on the edge and they're almost ready and there's a 5-inch rain coming, get them out of there.
Yeah.
Because of that bacteria.
Totally.
Is there a depth difference between putting them in plastic and not putting them in plastic?
A depth difference?
Okay.
The question is there a depth difference between when you plant them in plastic and when you plant them in dirt? And the answer, I would say no, except for us when we did that reuse of a plastic bed. It was very difficult to get them very deep at all, so they were actually pretty shallow in that planting. But otherwise, no, I wouldn't plant them differently depth-wise.
So depth-wise on our farm, we do it as deep as you can get them with your thumb. I don't know, how do you guys do it? I guess you do it by machine.
Yeah, just with that planter, it's not really... there's no real rhyme or reason. Yeah. Kate, if you should start with that one, maybe because you do it on dirt, and so you are.
Yeah. So I think there's probably someone who knows more than me that can answer that properly. But I think about weed control first, and so whatever it takes for me to get rid of the weeds is what I'm going to do. But I think there's probably an answer from what's better for the onion. And I think there's actually a debate amongst people. I don't know. Laura, do you know? Bury the bulb or not?
No. I say when they're little, I don't think it matters a whole lot. I just want to kill the weeds.
Yeah. I would agree with the weed killing.
Big, it probably starts to matter a little more.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to get your cultivator so close that you're shaving them. I mean,
Yeah.
I've accidentally done that.
The biggest issue I've seen with cultivating and hitting them is more with the belly, like having the undercarriage of the tractor hitting the tall leaves. Like if I try to, if I'm like, oh, those weeds are really bad, I'm going to try to sneak one last pass in there, but then I go in and I knock all the tops down and I create injuries on there. That's a great place for rot or other diseases to get in there. So I've regretted those late cultivations more than I've appreciated them.
And I've had different things happen different years. If I'm on top of the weeds all season long and the ground is kind of like the cultivator isn't going to kind of fit and start a lot and it's kind of a smooth flow, then I can almost cultivate all the way up to harvest. But the years where the weeds have gotten away from me, adding that last cultivation in will kill stuff. So it all has to do, especially with onions. Other crops, like broccoli, you can't keep going in. But like with onions, if you've been in all year, you should be able to go up all the way to harvest. And that was something that I kind of learned this year particularly.
You mentioned, I think, a strip hoe. What is a strip hoe?
I might have just said it real fast. A stirrup hoe, like a hula hoe, a reciprocating hoe. Those Johnny's Glazer, like.
It looks like a square, right?
It's a square, yeah, with a sharp. All right. It's got a little joint on it that as it cuts on the push and the pull, and it's shaped like a stirrup, like on a horse's
Is it like
saddle.
a hinge on it or not?
Yeah, it's got a little hinge on it, right where the.
I don't use one, so I don't know.
Yeah, I've got a Johnny's catalog in my bag somewhere here. I can show you afterwards if you'd like to see. Yeah, I like them. They're my favorite. One of my favorite hoes.
Thank you. What other questions do you guys have? Yeah, go ahead.
If you ever, because I noticed like you plant, like try to plant first week of April, and while you're on the other side of Iowa, I'm just across the border in Minnesota. There's been a couple occasions where, well, one time I planted a little early, it was the last week of April. We got up to 2 weeks of low temperature in low 40s.
Yeah.
And then just here a couple of years ago, I planted them like mid-May, and we had like low temperatures in the upper 30s, low 40s, and then I had all this bolting.
Oh, yeah, bolting. Wow. So I've had situations where last year in April, we were really worried about even if we could get in, if the soil temperature wasn't too high. And I don't know the stats off the top of my head, but I called the company that I get my starts from, and they had, I think they said that the soil temperature had to be above 40 maybe. I can't remember particularly. Does that sound right? 40 or 50, but they basically said I needed to make, because it looked like I could get in, but it was not a good idea. And so I think that that's important to think about, is what your soil temperature is. I suppose your air temperature as well.
Yeah. I don't have any good information about that.
What happened was it was around 1980, I planted 2,000 Spanish onions, and back then I go, oh, what's all this bolting going on like in August? So back then you didn't have the internet, so I called the university out of Utah, because they grow Spanish onions, but from seeds. They said they're bolting, and he said, well, did you have low temperatures at the beginning of the season once they got out there? And I said, yep, and he said, that's it. And I got those at Piedmont Plant Company. That was like Dixondale.
Yeah.
In Georgia, they went bankrupt.
And I think that's important to think about that early season. What happens in the early season and the weather can affect later things, and knowing the people to call, like, this is happening, what can I change next year? I think that's really great that you figured that out.
And the thing about Dixondale is they are gonna put those things on the truck on April 7th. And they don't care if the snow is 3 feet deep in Iowa.
You can't stop it once you've ordered them.
That's the day they're coming. So it's kind of just a bit of good luck if it works out.
Zach in the back.
I was going to say just, I started doing more onions from seed because we found that Dixondale, they will slip whenever, and they'll rot and they'll die, they'll go dormant, and you've got to water them or whatever. So if you transplant just from seeds and there's living plants that
Yeah.
you can just have them in a tray for a couple weeks longer.
I think that's a great comment, but that is also takes infrastructure that not everyone has. So thinking about different options depending on what infrastructure you have. But if you have the infrastructure to start your own plants, if you do that, though, I think it's important to remember to give them that haircut, because I've gotten them before. I've bought live plants from people before that didn't do that, and they're not big enough. So thinking about that process too. Go ahead.
A couple of years ago, the Dixondale ones, because they had so much heavy rain in Texas, were like really gunky when they arrived, because they pulled them all out of the ground when it was out of that clay soil.
Yeah.
It was just gross. But I've gone to a mix of Mennonite started plants and Dixondale, which
Yeah, that mix is great, because then you kind of spread your risk out that way. That's great.
Would these same practices
Yeah, I've grown shallots once. Or at the Student Organic Farm, we grew shallots, and we would save shallots from year to year, but and try to replant, but we ended up having really poor results with that, and we went to planting from seed, and we found that that got bigger, higher quality shallots than saving like garlic and planting, the ones that we saved. And there was a really good reason there that had some logic to it that I can't remember right now. But the seed ones I know were the two varieties that were available at the time from Johnny's is what we grew. I can't remember the names. One was a yellow, one was a red. But honestly, when we grew them, they both looked kind of bronze colored, and it was hard to tell them apart. But they were both very good and nice large cloves, if you will, or whatever they call those sections of a shallot. We grew them just like our onions in those, in the same system at the Student Organic Farm.
Did you notice a difference in storage between seed and saving the bowl?
No difference in storage. Because we'd save the ones that we kept would store until the middle of April when we planted them, and the other ones we would store that long also. So no difference. They were real good. I liked growing shallots.
I don't grow shallots just because it's the same amount of work as one onion, and they're a lot smaller.
Yeah.
And I'm in the business of getting people lots of food. So
Yeah.
for my system, I just choose not to grow the crop, but I do enjoy them when other people grow them.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dan.